The lights dimmed, the crowd buzzed, and a familiar figure walked out onto the Netflix stage. Jon Stewart, a man who had made a career out of dissecting politics, media, and culture with razor-sharp wit, stood there with that mischievous half-grin, the one that always made audiences lean forward, sensing he was about to say something both hilarious and devastating. But no one in that theater, or the millions who would later see the clips online, could have predicted how one line, one comedic jab, would ripple across the globe, leaving Meghan Markle at the center of another firestorm. This wasn't just comedy. This was cultural commentary wrapped in laughter, sharpened like a blade, and hurled into the heart of one of the most controversial figures of our time. Why Meghan? That's the question that hung in the air. Of all the names Jon Stewart could have skewered that night, it was Meghan Markle who became the target of one of his most viral punchlines. A joke that would ricochet across social media and headline news cycles. For some, it was pure comedy, a moment of catharsis, even justice. For others, it was cruel, beneath the belt, another unfair attack on a woman who had already endured years of criticism. But here's the thing about comedy. It doesn't just make us laugh. It makes us confront truths we might not want to face. And that's exactly why Stewart's words hit so hard. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The setup was simple. Stewart had been warming the crowd with a rhythm of political jabs and cultural observations when, almost casually, he pivoted toward Meghan Markle. There was no drumroll, no warning. He looked out at the audience, paused with perfect timing, and delivered the line, "Duchess of dumb shit." The room erupted. Laughter, gasps, even clapping. The kind of raw, unfiltered reaction you only get when people know they've just witnessed a cultural moment. It wasn't just a joke, it was a statement. And in that instant, Meghan Markle's carefully constructed image collided head-on with Stewart's unflinching humor. But let's take a step back. To understand why that moment exploded the way it did, you need to understand Meghan's story up until that point. The former actress turned duchess had become one of the most polarizing public figures in modern history. To some, she was a brave woman who walked away from the rigidity of the royal family, fighting for independence and carving her own path. To others, she was manipulative, calculating, and relentlessly opportunistic, constantly positioning herself as a victim while enjoying the privileges of global fame. That duality, savior to some, villain to others, made her the perfect lightning rod for a comedian like Stewart, whose career had always thrived on cutting through hypocrisy and holding public figures accountable. Comedy thrives on tension, and Meghan Markle embodied it. She was the glamorous outsider who married into the most rigid monarchy in the world, only to leave it behind amid drama, accusations, and endless interviews. Every time she spoke, people argued about whether she was brave or disingenuous. Every move she and Harry made, the Netflix deal, the Spotify fallout, the Oprah interview, became fodder for debate. And in a world where audiences were already fatigued by Meghan's constant presence in the news cycle, Stewart's line hit like a release valve. People laughed because it was funny, yes, but also because it crystallized what many had been feeling but didn't know how to articulate. That's the power of a joke when it lands at the right moment in history. The middle of this story isn't just about the punchline, though. It's about what happened in the seconds, minutes, and hours after. In the theater, some people laughed so hard they cried. Others sat in stunned silence, not sure if they should laugh at a duchess being ridiculed in such blunt terms. Within minutes, phones were out, clips were being recorded, hashtags were drafted. By the time Stewart finished his set, snippets of the joke were already circulating online, gaining momentum. Twitter threads lit up with debate. Some users gleefully shared the line, calling it the best thing Stewart has ever said. Others condemned it, labeling it misogynistic or unfair. TikTok edits layered the joke over montages of Meghan's past interviews. Instagram Reels turned the phrase into a meme. What started as one man on a stage became a worldwide cultural phenomenon. But why did it go viral so fast? The answer lies in timing. Meghan Markle was already at the center of controversy. Questions about her authenticity, her relationship with the royal family, and the collapse of her and Harry's business ventures were swirling in the press. Netflix itself, the very platform that had invested heavily in Meghan and Harry, was facing backlash over whether their deal had been worth the money. And here came Jon Stewart, on Netflix's own stage, ridiculing one of their most high-profile figures. It was irony layered upon irony, and audiences couldn't resist sharing it. For critics of Meghan, it was proof that even comedians were tired of her. For her defenders, it was proof of a coordinated smear campaign. Either way, everyone had an opinion, and that's what fueled the fire. The end of this introduction isn't about the joke itself, but about the stakes it represents. This wasn't just about Meghan Markle being called a name on a comedy special. It was about the intersection of comedy, celebrity, and cultural power. It was about the role of humor in shaping how we see public figures. And most importantly, it was about a single moment of entertainment becoming a global talking point, one that forced people to confront their own feelings about Meghan, the royals, and the fine line between satire and cruelty. As the laughter echoed across the internet, the question grew louder. Was this just comedy, or was it something much deeper? That's the journey we're about to take you on. We'll explore the rise of Jon Stewart as a cultural voice, Meghan Markle's complicated relationship with fame, and the exact moment where those two worlds collided. We'll break down how one punchline became a headline, why the world reacted the way it did, and what it reveals about the way we consume celebrity in the 21st century. By the end, you'll see this wasn't just a joke. It was a mirror held up to society, and what it reflected left no one untouched. And that's only the beginning. The moment Jon Stewart dropped that now infamous line, calling Meghan Markle the Duchess of Dumb Shit, he wasn't just tossing out a casual insult. He was holding up a mirror to a global audience and forcing them to confront the contradictions, the fatigue, and the spectacle that Meghan's public life had become. Comedy, at its sharpest, exposes truths we often avoid, and Stewart knew exactly how to cut through the noise. The audience's reaction wasn't just about laughter, it was about release. Years of pent-up frustration, fascination, and division surrounding Meghan seemed to erupt in one collective roar. Some people laughed because they thought she deserved it. Others laughed because they were shocked anyone would dare say it out loud. And then there were those who didn't laugh at all, sitting uncomfortably in their seats, wondering if the line crossed a boundary. That mix of reactions is precisely why the moment exploded into something bigger than the stage it was born on. The beginning of this story is not just about Jon Stewart making a joke. It's about timing, cultural tension, and the unpredictability of how audiences respond when comedy collides with royalty. Meghan Markle had already been living in the crosshairs of media scrutiny, and Stewart's words seemed to tap directly into the narrative so many people had already been writing in their minds. But instead of an op-ed, instead of a think piece, this commentary came wrapped in satire, hitting harder than any editorial could. And that's what makes the opening of this story so gripping. It's not just a tale of laughter, but a moment of truth disguised as comedy. Now, in the middle of this introduction, let's look at why Meghan Markle, specifically, became such fertile ground for Stewart's wit. The story of Meghan is unlike any other in modern celebrity culture. She wasn't born into the aristocracy, yet she entered it. She wasn't raised to be a duchess, yet she became one. For a brief moment, it looked like a fairy tale. But soon after, the fairy tale unraveled in full view of the world. Accusations of racism in the royal family, a dramatic exit dubbed Megxit, public interviews where she painted herself as misunderstood, silenced, even victimized. All of this fueled debates across households, workplaces, and social media timelines. Every time Meghan opened her mouth, people took sides. Some saw bravery, others saw manipulation. And that constant split is exactly what makes her a target that comedians can't resist. When Stewart took aim at Meghan, he wasn't just mocking her as an individual. He was mocking the circus that has surrounded her since the day she first walked into royal life. The audience's laughter carried layers. Some were laughing at Meghan, some at the royals, and some at the sheer absurdity of the spectacle itself. Because in truth, Meghan Markle isn't just Meghan Markle anymore. She is a symbol of ambition, of rebellion, of hypocrisy, depending on who you ask. That's why one punchline turned into a viral moment. Stewart knew he wasn't just telling a joke. He was detonating a cultural grenade. What followed immediately after the line proved this point. The crowd's laughter wasn't polite. It wasn't the kind of chuckle you hear when a comedian delivers a clever observation. It was loud, unrestrained, and almost cathartic. People slapped their knees, leaned back in their seats, shouted, "Oh my God," between bursts of laughter. Some gasped in shock, looking around as if to confirm they weren't alone in their reaction. That kind of eruption doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from an audience that has been waiting for someone, anyone, to put into words what they've been feeling but couldn't say out loud. Stewart gave them that, and that's what transformed this moment into something unforgettable. But while the laughter echoed through the venue, something even more powerful was happening beyond those walls. Phones lit up. Clips were recorded and instantly uploaded. Within minutes, social media platforms were ablaze. Hashtags began trending. Memes were born in real time. By the time Stewart had left the stage, the internet was already dissecting the joke. Twitter users debated its fairness. TikTok creators layered the punchline over montages of Meghan's most infamous moments. Instagram accounts turned it into a viral meme. And on YouTube, reaction videos popped up, some praising Stewart for telling the truth, others condemning him for punching down. The joke wasn't just a joke anymore. It had become a conversation, one that reached millions of people across the globe. And this brings us to the real crux of the introduction. What does it mean when a single joke, delivered in a few seconds, becomes a cultural event? Why did this one line cut deeper than countless articles, interviews, and debates about Meghan Markle? The answer lies in the intersection of comedy and truth. People trust comedians in a way they don't trust politicians or journalists. A politician might make a speech criticizing Meghan, and it would be dismissed as agenda-driven. A journalist might write a piece, and it would be dismissed as biased. But when Jon Stewart cracks a joke, people laugh. And in that laughter, they often admit to truths they'd never say outright. Comedy disarms us. It sneaks past our defenses. And that's exactly what happened here. Stewart said what many were thinking, but only in laughter could they acknowledge it. The end of this introduction isn't about closing the story, but about opening it up. We've set the stage. A comedian, a duchess, a line that detonated like dynamite, and a crowd that couldn't contain itself. But this is only the surface. What lies beneath is even more gripping. Because this wasn't just Stewart mocking Meghan. It was a reflection of how the world sees her, how the media feeds on her, and how divided we've become over her very existence in the public eye. Was Stewart cruel, or was he courageous? Was the audience laughing at Meghan, or were they laughing at the absurdity of the monarchy itself? Did the joke expose Meghan, or did it expose us, the consumers of this never-ending spectacle? As this story unfolds, we'll dive deeper into Jon Stewart's history of fearless comedy, Meghan's complicated reputation, and why their collision on that stage was inevitable. We'll examine how one punchline spread across the globe like wildfire, igniting debates that stretched from royal fans to comedians to political commentators. And most importantly, we'll explore what this moment reveals about our culture, our obsession with celebrity, and the way we use humor to make sense of the chaos around us. This introduction has given you the setup. You've seen the stage, felt the tension, and heard the echo of that one unforgettable line. Now, as we step into the chapters ahead, the story will only get richer, messier, and more explosive. Because what Jon Stewart unleashed wasn't just a laugh, it was a reckoning. And reckoning always demands we look closer. When Jon Stewart walked back into the spotlight with his Netflix special, it wasn't just another comedian returning to the stage. It was a cultural moment. Stewart had spent years as the face of The Daily Show, a platform he turned into a political force, where humor became a weapon sharper than most journalistic editorials. He was the man who could take a scandal, a corrupt system, or a tone-deaf politician and dismantle them with a few lines, leaving the audience laughing while simultaneously questioning the world around them. When he left that platform, many felt a void. Other comedians tried to fill it, but none could capture the balance Stewart maintained between humor and truth. So when news broke that he would return with a Netflix special, anticipation skyrocketed. What would he say? Who would be his new targets? And could he still deliver the kind of devastating comedy that made him a cultural giant? The night of the special carried the weight of those expectations. Netflix promoted it heavily, framing Stewart as the legendary voice returning to bring laughter and insight to a world that desperately needed both. Audiences arrived with excitement, but also curiosity. Comedy had changed in recent years. Cancel culture, political correctness, and heightened sensitivity had shifted the boundaries of what could be said on stage. The question wasn't just whether Stewart still had it, but whether he would dare to push those boundaries in an era where every word was dissected, recorded, and broadcast worldwide within seconds. From the moment he walked on stage, Stewart radiated the same energy he always had, sharp, deliberate, and slightly mischievous. He paced slowly, letting the audience feel the pause before the punchlines. His voice carried the same mix of humor and authority, a tone that let people know he wasn't just here to make them laugh. He was here to make them think. The first 15 minutes of the set the tone, a mixture of political satire, cultural critique, and playful storytelling. The crowd was hooked, but there was a tension lingering in the room. Stewart wasn't just going to play it safe. Everyone knew he was building towards something bigger. That's what makes Stewart different. Unlike other comedians who scatter jokes without direction, Stewart builds. He layers his sets like a narrative, weaving observations together until they reach a climax that feels both inevitable and explosive. And this night was no exception. The audience laughed at his takes on politics, roared at his critiques of media hypocrisy, and nodded in recognition when he pointed out the absurdities of modern culture. But under the laughter, there was anticipation. Who would be the night's central target? The return of Jon Stewart also carried weight beyond comedy. Over the years, he had stepped back from the limelight, choosing selective appearances and focusing on causes close to his heart, like advocating for 9/11 first responders. That absence only strengthened his reputation. Unlike comedians who churn out specials every year, Stewart had made the audience wait. And waiting builds hunger. By the time he stepped on the Netflix stage, people weren't just hoping to laugh. They were hoping to witness a cultural event, the kind of moment people would talk about the next morning and replay online for weeks. In this context, Stewart's decision to target Meghan Markle becomes clearer. Comedy thrives on relevance, and Meghan was at the peak of public debate. Her every move was scrutinized. The Netflix documentaries, the interviews, the drama with the royals, the failed Spotify deal. She had become both a symbol of empowerment and of opportunism, depending on which side of the debate you stood. Stewart knew this, and he knew that if he landed the right line, the audience would not only laugh, but also feel the shock of recognition. This wasn't just picking a random celebrity. This was zeroing in on someone who embodied cultural contradictions, and Stewart had always been a master at exposing those contradictions. But to fully appreciate why his joke resonated, you have to remember who Stewart is in the comedy world. He's not a tabloid satirist throwing cheap shots for claps. He's the comedian who made a career of holding up the absurdities of powerful figures and institutions. He built trust with audiences because he didn't just go for the easy laugh. His jokes were laced with research, context, and insight. He earned credibility as someone who punched up, never down. That's why his audience has always been loyal. When Stewart points out something, people listen because they know he's not just mocking for the sake of cruelty. So when Stewart delivered his line about Meghan, it carried the weight of that credibility. The audience knew he wasn't just pulling a random insult out of thin air. They felt it was coming from someone who had built his career on exposing pretension, arrogance, and hypocrisy. That context is what transformed the joke into a viral sensation. If another comedian had said the same thing, it might have been dismissed as mean-spirited or attention-seeking. But when Jon Stewart said it, it landed differently. It landed as truth cloaked in humor, the kind of truth that audiences had come to expect from him. The return of Stewart wasn't just about one joke or one target. It was about reminding people why he mattered in the first place. The stage belonged to him in a way few comedians could command. The audience hung on his words not because they wanted to laugh mindlessly, but because they wanted to see the world reframed through his lens. And reframing the world through comedy is Stewart's gift. He doesn't just tell jokes. He changes how you see the people and institutions around you. By the time the night was over, he had delivered exactly what audiences wanted: sharp, fearless, and unforgettable comedy. But that one line, the one about Meghan, rose above the rest because it tapped into something universal. Stewart's return confirmed something crucial about comedy. In a world oversaturated with noise, The right comedian at the right time can still break through and dominate the cultural conversation. His Netflix special didn't just bring back Jon Stewart. It reminded everyone why his voice has always been so powerful. And for Meghan Markle, it marked the beginning of yet another chapter in her already complicated story, one she didn't choose but couldn't escape. The comedy king had returned, and in doing so, he had reclaimed his throne. And the first casualty of his comeback was a duchess whose name, for one night, became the punchline heard around the world. To understand why Jon Stewart's joke struck such a chord, we have to rewind and examine Meghan Markle's reputation before that fateful night. Comedy doesn't exist in a vacuum. A punchline only lands if there's already a story, a tension, or a shared cultural understanding that makes it resonate. And Meghan, by the time Stewart took the stage, had built one of the most polarizing reputations in modern celebrity history. Her name was no longer just tied to her acting career or her role as Prince Harry's wife. It had become a lightning rod, evoking either admiration or disdain, depending on who you asked. When Meghan first appeared on the public stage as Harry's girlfriend, she was celebrated. Here was a woman who broke barriers, an American actress, biracial, successful in her own right, stepping into the most traditional monarchy in the world. At first, it felt refreshing. People called her a modern princess, a symbol of change for an institution that had long been accused of being archaic and out of touch. The royal family, once seen as stiff and unrelatable, seemed to gain a spark of vitality with Meghan's arrival. Newspapers printed glowing headlines about her charm, her fashion sense, her poise. For a brief moment, it looked like Meghan had written herself into a fairy tale. But fairy tales rarely last when they collide with reality, especially royal reality. The British monarchy thrives on tradition, hierarchy, and rules that often seem bizarre to outsiders. Meghan was a woman used to independence, speaking her mind, making her own choices. That clashed almost immediately with the expectations placed on her as a duchess. Soon, reports began trickling into the press about Meghan struggling with the royal system. Rumors of clashes with palace staff, whispers of disagreements with Kate Middleton, and anonymous sources painting her as difficult and demanding began to take root. What started as admiration began to shift into criticism. The shift was subtle at first, but it snowballed quickly. By the time Meghan and Harry married in 2018, the press had already started to turn. Every move she made was scrutinized, her wardrobe choices, her speeches, her interactions with the public. And unlike Kate, who was painted as the dutiful, graceful royal, Meghan was often portrayed as brash, rebellious, even arrogant. This wasn't just a matter of gossip columns. It became part of a larger narrative about Meghan's place in the monarchy. Was she the victim of an outdated system resistant to change? Or was she a manipulator who knew how to play the victim card to her advantage? The infamous Oprah Winfrey interview in 2021 cemented Meghan's polarizing image. On one hand, she revealed deeply personal struggles, including suicidal thoughts and claims of racism within the royal family. To many, it was a shocking and brave moment. Meghan became a symbol of resilience, a woman who refused to be silenced. But to others, it felt calculated, even theatrical. Critics argued that Meghan and Harry had chosen to air their grievances for profit and attention, undermining the very family they had once pledged loyalty to. Overnight, Meghan went from victim to villain in the eyes of many. Her media ventures only deepened the divide. The multi-million-dollar Netflix deal promised groundbreaking content, but delivered little more than a docuseries that critics labeled self-indulgent. The Spotify deal collapsed with executives publicly mocking the couple, calling them lazy and ill-prepared. Meghan's attempts to position herself as a humanitarian and cultural icon often fell flat, overshadowed by accusations that she was more interested in fame and money than genuine impact. The term grifters, used by Spotify executives, quickly attached itself to her and Harry in the public conversation. By the time Jon Stewart's Netflix special aired, Meghan wasn't just a public figure. She was a cultural Rorschach test. To her supporters, she represented courage, a woman who stood up against one of the most powerful families in the world. To her critics, she embodied entitlement, hypocrisy, and opportunism. And in comedy, that kind of division is gold. A comedian doesn't target someone universally loved or universally hated. They target someone who sparks debate, someone who carries cultural baggage that an audience can immediately recognize. Meghan had become exactly that. The key to understanding her reputation lies in the constant contradictions that defined her public life. She claimed she wanted privacy, but signed multi-million-dollar media deals. She painted herself as an outsider bullied by the royals, but appeared in high-profile interviews that dominated global headlines. She positioned herself as a voice for women's empowerment, but was accused of mistreating staff. These contradictions weren't just mistakes. They became her defining traits in the public eye. Every story about her seemed to feed into the narrative of Meghan as both victim and opportunist. Trapped in a cycle of drama, she both endured and created. That's why Stewart's joke hit so hard. By calling her the Duchess of Dumb Shit, he wasn't inventing a critique out of nowhere. He was tapping into a frustration many people already felt, that Meghan's words and actions often didn't align, that her image of strength and empowerment was undermined by choices that seemed shallow or self-serving. The audience didn't just laugh because the word was shocking. They laughed because it crystallized what they had been thinking but hadn't said out loud. Comedy, at its best, is about saying the unsayable, and Stewart had just done that. But before the joke, Meghan's reputation had already reached a tipping point. She had become someone the public didn't just watch, they dissected. Every hairstyle, every podcast, every move became a headline. That overexposure turned her into a figure people loved to debate. And debates always need a trigger, something to ignite them. Stewart's special was that trigger. Without Meghan's complex reputation, a mix of admiration, resentment, and exhaustion, the joke wouldn't have traveled the way it did. It would have been another throwaway line in a comedy set. Instead, it became a viral moment because it touched the nerve of an audience already primed to react. By the time Stewart took the stage, Meghan was no longer the fairy tale duchess the world once celebrated. She was a symbol of cultural fatigue, someone whose every attempt at reinvention only seemed to deepen the divide around her. And in that divide, comedy found fertile ground. The night of Jon Stewart's Netflix special wasn't just another comedy show on a streaming platform. It was an event. The build-up leading to it carried with it a sense of nostalgia, anticipation, and curiosity. Stewart hadn't been a constant presence on stage for years, and his reputation for delivering sharp, cultural dissections made his comeback something people couldn't ignore. The world had changed since his Daily Show days. Comedy was riskier, more scrutinized. Every joke was a potential headline, every laugh a potential controversy. And Stewart knew that walking onto that stage meant more than just entertaining an audience. It meant proving he could still master a room, still cut through cultural noise, and still be the voice that pushed people to laugh while confronting uncomfortable truths. The theater itself was electric. Netflix had spared no expense. The staging was sleek but understated, letting Stewart be the focus rather than the production. Rows upon rows of fans filled the venue, some there because they had grown up with Stewart's biting wit, others curious to see how he would adapt to a world more fragile and divided than before. You could feel the audience shifting in their seats as the lights dimmed, a mixture of excitement and nervousness hanging in the air. There was an unspoken expectation. Stewart wasn't just going to tell jokes. He was going to make a statement. From the first moment he spoke, he commanded the room. His pacing was deliberate, his tone playful yet purposeful. He opened with material that felt safe enough, jokes about politics, absurdities in the media, reflections on the state of technology and culture. The laughter came quickly and easily, a reminder that the audience had missed him. But beneath the rhythm of his set, there was a subtle tension building. Stewart had always been more than a comedian. He was a commentator, a cultural mirror. And the audience wasn't just there for humor. They were waiting for that one moment that would break through the noise, that would remind them of why his voice mattered. As the set unfolded, Stewart began shifting gears. He moved from lighter cultural observations to sharper critiques. He poked fun at politicians who had become parodies of themselves, at the absurdities of corporations pretending to be moral authorities, at the contradictions of a society obsessed with both canceling and idolizing celebrities. The audience laughed, but they also nodded, recognizing the truths hidden within his punchlines. That's what Stewart had always done best. He didn't just make people laugh. He made them complicit in the recognition of their own absurd world. And then came the pivot. The moment in every great comedy set when the comedian decides to step into riskier territory. For Stewart, it was the decision to move from politicians and media to Meghan Markle. It wasn't obvious at first. He started with broader commentary about celebrity culture, about how fame in the modern era had less to do with talent and more to do with attention. He talked about how audiences consume celebrities like products, obsessing over them one moment and discarding them the next. The crowd laughed, but they leaned in too, sensing something bigger was coming. It was in that context, the absurdity of modern celebrity, that Stewart transitioned into Meghan. The shift was seamless, almost casual, but deliberate. He framed her not as a villain or a victim, but as an emblem of the contradictions in how we treat public figures. And then, with perfect comedic timing, he delivered the line that would change the entire night. Duchess of Dumbshit. The words hung in the air for a split second before the crowd erupted. It was the eruption that defined the night, and without the careful setup, it wouldn't have landed the way it did. The genius of Stewart's delivery was not just the line itself, but the way he led up to it. He didn't attack Meghan out of nowhere. He positioned her within the broader absurdity of celebrity culture. He built the tension with commentary about fame, hypocrisy, and privilege, and then punctured it with a phrase so blunt and so unexpected that it shocked and delighted the audience simultaneously. That's the art of comedy timing, knowing not only what to say, but when to say it. What's important here is that Stewart's audience was primed for the joke long before it landed. They had been nodding and laughing at his commentary on culture's contradictions. They were already thinking about how celebrities present themselves and how often that presentation doesn't match reality. So when Meghan became the focal point of his punchline, it felt natural, inevitable even. The crowd wasn't just laughing at Meghan. They were laughing at the entire machine of fame and the contradictions it represents. But none of this would have worked if not for the setting of the Netflix special itself. Netflix gave Stewart a platform larger than any comedy club stage, larger even than cable television. This wasn't late-night television, where jokes disappear by the next day. This was streaming, where moments live forever, replayed endlessly, dissected by audiences around the globe. When Stewart said those words, he wasn't just speaking to the people in the theater. He was speaking to millions who would watch later, clip it, share it, and debate it online. The permanence of streaming amplified the impact of the joke in a way traditional comedy specials never could. And then there was the irony. The joke about Meghan landed on Netflix, the very platform that had invested millions in her and Harry. It was almost poetic. Netflix had bet big on Meghan and Harry, promoting their story as one of courage and reinvention, only for one of their most respected comedic voices to dismantle that image on the same stage. The audience may not have thought about it in the moment, but the cultural weight of that irony wasn't lost once the clip hit the internet. Critics, fans, and commentators all pointed out the delicious contradiction. Meghan Markle, once Netflix's golden investment, being ridiculed in a viral moment on Netflix's own dime. The stage, the audience, the platform, the timing, every piece came together that night. The joke was powerful on its own, but it became iconic because of the circumstances surrounding it. Stewart's Netflix special wasn't just a comeback. It was a reminder of comedy's ability to dominate cultural conversation. And in Meghan Markle, he found the perfect subject to crystallize that reminder. By the end of the night, the audience knew they had witnessed more than a comedy set. They had seen the return of a master at work, someone who could still command a stage, cut through cultural clutter, and turn one line into a moment the world couldn't stop talking about. What was supposed to be a night of laughter became something bigger. A night that reframed Meghan Markle's image yet again, and reminded everyone why Jon Stewart's voice still carries so much weight. There is a certain rhythm to great comedy, a heartbeat that pulses through every setup and every delivery until the moment comes when it all collapses into laughter. Jon Stewart had been working the stage like a surgeon, cutting into politics, media, and culture with his scalpel-sharp humor. But everyone in that room sensed that something bigger was coming, something more than just a string of clever lines. Stewart had always been a master at letting the audience feel the build-up, keeping them on edge until the release was both shocking and inevitable. The night of his Netflix special was no different. The audience was already warm, laughing hard at his takes on social absurdities. Stewart had them nodding along when he mocked politicians, cheering when he ripped into corporations, and groaning with amusement when he pointed out the contradictions of a culture obsessed with outrage and fame. But beneath the laughs, there was anticipation. Stewart had been pacing, dropping hints, almost as if he was circling prey. Every comedian knows that you can't waste the moment when a room is leaning forward, waiting. Stewart knew exactly when to pounce. He shifted gears into a reflection on celebrity, how fame today no longer works the way it used to. He talked about the cult of personality, about people whose lives become constant headlines not because of what they accomplish, but because of what they represent. The audience laughed at the absurdity of it all, but they were also waiting for a name. They knew Stewart wasn't going to just speak in generalities. He was leading them somewhere. And then it happened. He stopped, looked out at the audience with that mischievous grin, paused for just long enough to let the silence build, and dropped the line that would ricochet around the world. Duchess of dumb shit. For a half-second, the room froze. There was that moment of stunned silence, the collective gasp when people aren't sure if they heard what they think they heard. And then it broke. Laughter erupted, raw and uncontrollable. Some people doubled over in their seats, tears running down their faces. Others clapped, stomping their feet as if applauding a piece of theater. A few sat in shock, hands over their mouths, laughing but not quite believing Stewart had gone there. That split second of disbelief followed by the tidal wave of laughter was what turned the joke into more than a line. It became a moment. The rhythm of the punchline was as important as the words themselves. Stewart had built the tension so perfectly that when he let it go, it exploded. Timing in comedy is everything, and Stewart's timing was flawless. He had lulled the audience into a flow with broader cultural critiques, then yanked them out of it with a jab so specific and so blunt that they couldn't contain their reaction. It was the kind of punchline that doesn't just land, it detonates. But what made it even more effective was the weight of context. Everyone in that audience knew Meghan Markle. They knew the headlines, the controversies, the interviews, the documentaries. She was a figure who had dominated the cultural conversation for years, someone people couldn't avoid even if they wanted to. So when Stewart reduced all of that noise, all of that drama, to 3 words, it was like watching a balloon pop. The audience wasn't just laughing at Meghan. They were laughing at the absurdity of it all, the spectacle of her life, the endless debates, the contradictions. Stewart had condensed years of cultural fatigue into one punchline. And the reaction didn't stop at laughter. As people wiped tears from their eyes, they reached for their phones. In that theater, dozens of cameras were lifted, capturing the moment. Within minutes, the line was on social media. Clips of the punchline hit Twitter and TikTok almost instantly. The audience wasn't just laughing. They were sharing, turning the moment into something bigger than the theater. That's when the first wave of virality began. In the room, the laughter carried an energy that was almost physical. People were leaning into strangers, repeating the line, shaking their heads in disbelief. The kind of laughter that makes you feel like you're part of something historic. That's what comedy can do when it strikes the right chord. It doesn't just make people laugh. It unites them, if only for a moment, in recognition of something absurd and undeniable. Stewart had tapped into that collective recognition, and the crowd responded as though they had been waiting years for someone to say it out loud. And yet, even as the crowd roared, there was another undercurrent, the awareness that this joke would not stay in that room. Everyone knew it was going to spread, that it was going to cause debate, that it was going to rattle cages beyond the theater walls. You could see it in the way people reacted, half laughing, half shaking their heads as if to say, "He didn't just say that, did he?" Comedy, when it works at its most dangerous, doesn't just make people laugh. It makes them ask questions. The first punchline had landed, and it wasn't just a joke. It was a spark that would light the fire of debates across the internet, ignite fury and celebration in equal measure, and dominate headlines in the days to come. Stewart had done what only great comedians can do. He took a cultural figure who seemed untouchable and cut her down to size with one unforgettable line. But in that moment, inside the theater, it was still about the laughter. The raw, unfiltered laughter that shook the room. It was the laughter of release, the kind that only comes when someone has said what so many people were thinking but didn't dare to say out loud. That's why the joke worked. Not because it was mean, not because it was shocking, but because it crystallized a truth that had been hanging in the air for years, waiting for someone brave enough, or reckless enough, to put it into words. The first punchline had landed, and nothing would be the same after it. When Jon Stewart let those words roll off his tongue, it was as if the air in the room shifted. Duchess of Dumbshit. 3 words, sharp as a knife, that sliced through the noise of Meghan Markle's carefully curated image. It wasn't just a punchline, it was a declaration. And in that declaration, the audience found something they hadn't realized they were waiting for: release. For years, Meghan had dominated headlines. Her name had become a constant in conversations about the monarchy, about race, about privilege, about celebrity. But never had anyone in the mainstream dared to strip her image down so bluntly, with such unapologetic force. Stewart did what few dared. He cut through the layers of spin and spectacle with one devastating line. The eruption of laughter inside the theater wasn't simply about humor. It was catharsis. People weren't just laughing at the absurdity of the insult. They were laughing at the absurdity of Meghan's entire public narrative. Stewart had reduced years of drama, interviews, podcasts, and royal controversies into one biting label that seemed, to many in the audience, to sum up their frustrations. The way he said it, the pause, the smirk, the deliberate precision, ensured the words would echo beyond the stage. There was nothing accidental about it. Stewart understood the mechanics of cultural commentary. He knew the moment he dropped that line, it would live far longer than the night's performance. What made the phrase so powerful was its bluntness. Comedy often thrives on clever wordplay, but Stewart knew that sometimes the most effective punch is the one without frills. The word dumb shit hit differently because it was raw, unvarnished, unfiltered. It wasn't wrapped in satire or softened with nuance. It was direct, and in that directness, people found honesty. To Meghan's critics, it was as though Stewart had finally said what they had been screaming into their screens for years. To her supporters, it was jarring, offensive, and cruel. But that division only amplified the power of the joke. If everyone had agreed, it would have faded quickly. The fact that it sparked both cheers and outrage is what gave it life. The crowd's reaction inside the theater was instantaneous and overwhelming. People laughed so hard they had to hold on to their seats. Some repeated the line to the person next to them, their voices a mix of disbelief and glee. Others gasped, covering their mouths, not because they were offended, but because they couldn't believe Stewart had gone there. The laughter was layered with shock, the kind of laughter that comes from seeing a line crossed and realizing it was worth crossing. In that moment, the audience wasn't just watching a comedy show. They were witnessing a cultural moment. Beyond the theater walls, the phrase spread like wildfire. Within minutes, clips of the joke were online. The words Duchess of Dumbshit were trending on Twitter. TikTok creators looped the line over montages of Meghan's most controversial moments: walking away from royal duties, sitting with Oprah, standing on stages delivering carefully scripted speeches. Instagram pages turned it into a meme, pairing it with images of Meghan looking self-important or aloof. The internet feasted on the phrase, and every share, every retweet, every post amplified its impact. It was no longer just Jon Stewart's joke. It had become part of the cultural lexicon. But the true brilliance of the line wasn't just its virality. It was how it managed to condense years of debate into one unforgettable label. Meghan had spent years positioning herself as misunderstood, silenced, a victim of a cruel system. At the same time, critics accused her of being manipulative, entitled, and hypocritical. Stewart's line didn't attempt to untangle those contradictions. It dismissed them entirely, reducing the whole spectacle to something laughable. For those exhausted by Meghan's constant presence in the headlines, the phrase became a shorthand for their frustration. And yet, the insult wasn't just about Meghan. It reflected something bigger, the fatigue of audiences with celebrity culture itself. Stewart wasn't just mocking a duchess. He was mocking the absurdity of a world where someone could dominate global conversation not for achievements, but for drama. The Duchess of Dumbshit wasn't just Meghan in that moment. She was a symbol of everything people had grown tired of: endless victim narratives, overexposure, self-importance. Stewart had named what so many felt about not just Meghan but the culture that allowed her to thrive. The line also carried with it a subtle defiance. In a time when comedians were increasingly under fire for pushing boundaries, Stewart's choice to aim directly at Meghan, a figure both celebrated and criticized, was bold. He wasn't mocking a powerless target. He was mocking someone who wielded fame, influence, and media connections. That distinction mattered. It wasn't punching down. It was, in Stewart's eyes, punching at the spectacle itself. The crowd recognized that distinction instinctively, which is why they erupted instead of recoiling. But make no mistake, the backlash began almost as quickly as the laughter. Meghan's defenders flooded social media, condemning Stewart for cruelty and misogyny. Some argued that mocking a woman who had spoken publicly about her struggles with mental health was crossing a line. Others accused Stewart of giving ammunition to Meghan's most vicious critics. Yet, ironically, the outrage only ensured the line traveled further. Every article condemning Stewart repeated the phrase. Every tweet attacking him also broadcast the joke to new audiences. The backlash didn't bury the line, it amplified it. Inside the theater, though, Stewart wasn't thinking about hashtags or headlines. He was thinking about timing, delivery, and the satisfaction of a joke that landed perfectly. The joy of a comedian isn't just in getting a laugh. It's in creating a moment that sticks, a line that people will repeat long after the night is over. And as the audience roared, Stewart knew he had done exactly that. The Duchess of Dumbshit moment wasn't just about humor. It was about the collision of comedy, culture, and controversy. It was about the way one man on a stage could reshape a narrative with 3 words. Meghan's image, already fragile, became the butt of a joke that millions found impossible to forget. And in that transformation, Stewart reminded the world why comedy remains one of the most powerful forces in culture. The phrase echoed long after the laughter died down. It was quoted in headlines, debated on talk shows, and dissected in op-eds. It was celebrated, condemned, and memed into eternity. But above all, it was remembered. And in the world of comedy, there is no greater victory. The moment Jon Stewart uttered those 3 words, the impact was immediate inside the theater. But the true explosion happened outside, in the vast, uncontrollable universe of the internet. In the modern world, a joke doesn't just live in the room where it is told. It travels, it mutates, it grows legs. And when the joke is as sharp, controversial, and perfectly timed as the Duchess of Dumbshit line, it doesn't just travel, it detonates. The first wave of virality came from the audience itself. Phones had been discreetly recording, and the second Stewart delivered the punchline, dozens of clips were already being uploaded. Within 15 minutes, Twitter, or X, as it had recently been renamed, had several trending hashtags attached to the joke. Hashtag Duchess of Dumbshit, hashtag Jon Stewart, and hashtag Meghan Markle were climbing the charts, with thousands of tweets flooding timelines every second. Some users shared the clip gleefully, captioning it with crying laughing emojis, while others condemned Stewart for punching down. The divide was immediate, and that division is what guaranteed the clip's reach. Controversy doesn't stifle virality, it fuels it. By the end of the night, TikTok had turned the line into a cultural phenomenon. Creators stitched the clip with their own commentary. Some played it over compilations of Meghan's most infamous moments, walking out of royal engagements, delivering speeches in designer dresses, or appearing in Netflix documentaries with Harry. Others simply replayed the joke on loop, overlaying captions like, "Jon Stewart said what we've all been thinking," or "the joke of the decade." Within 24 hours, the line had been viewed millions of times across platforms. Instagram meme accounts were even faster. Screenshots of Stewart's smirk paired with the words Duchess of Dumbshit circulated in thousands of variations. Some mocked Meghan, others mocked the media frenzy itself, but all carried the same underlying message. Stewart's line had pierced the culture in a way few jokes ever do. Even Facebook, usually slower to catch trends, was flooded with reposts of the clip, particularly in royal fan groups where debates about Meghan had raged for years. What made the virality unstoppable was that everyone had an opinion. Meghan's critics saw it as validation. They argued that Stewart had exposed her hypocrisy, her constant contradictions, and her endless victim narrative in the bluntest way possible. They flooded comment sections with praise for Stewart, calling him brave, fearless, even a hero. On the other side, Meghan's defenders mobilized just as quickly. They accused Stewart of cruelty, of mocking a woman who had publicly spoken about her mental health struggles, of fueling misogyny and racism. They insisted the joke was not just comedy, but an attack rooted in prejudice. The clash of these two sides created the perfect storm. Every defense of Meghan repeated the joke. Every attack on Stewart amplified it. The internet, built on outrage and repetition, ensured that the line was inescapable. By the next morning, major news outlets were covering it. Headlines ranged from Jon Stewart sparks outrage with Meghan Markle joke to comedian goes viral for brutally mocking Duchess. Television segments replayed the clip, talk radio debated its meaning, and late-night hosts even referenced it in their own monologues. In less than a day, Stewart's line had become part of the cultural conversation at every level. The virality wasn't limited to English-speaking countries. Subtitled versions of the clip appeared in Spanish, French, German, and Japanese, spreading the phrase across borders. International outlets weighed in, some amused by Stewart's audacity, others critical of American comedians for taking shots at British royalty. The Duchess of Dumbshit line had transcended geography, becoming a global meme. In an era where cultural moments can be fleeting, this one had staying power. What made the explosion so fascinating was the irony of the platform. Netflix, the very company that had invested tens of millions into Meghan and Harry's content, had become the stage for her most humiliating public mockery. Commentators were quick to point out the contradiction. Netflix paid Meghan to tell her story, one viral tweet read, but Jon Stewart told it better in 3 words. That irony fueled even more discourse, with critics questioning whether Netflix had unwittingly undermined its own investment. The phrase also began appearing in unexpected places. Protesters outside royal events held up signs quoting Stewart. T-shirts were printed within days, some featuring Stewart's face, others featuring caricatures of Meghan with the phrase beneath. Online stores reported selling out of merchandise that capitalized on the viral moment. Even political commentators got in on the act, using the phrase as shorthand in debates about hypocrisy or opportunism. The line had broken free of comedy and entered the language of everyday discourse. But virality always comes with consequences. Meghan and Harry's team reportedly went into crisis mode, debating whether to respond or remain silent. Every move they made risked amplifying the joke further. If they spoke out, critics would accuse them of being humorless and thin-skinned. If they ignored it, the silence would be seen as defeat. Their allies in the media wrote columns condemning Stewart, but these only fueled the fire. The more they tried to frame the joke as cruel, the more it spread. Meanwhile, comedians around the world watched closely. Some praised Stewart for being fearless in an era where comedy is often policed. Others worried it would set a precedent for backlash, where one viral line could overshadow an entire set. But regardless of where they stood, they all recognized the brilliance of the moment. Stewart had reminded the world of comedy's enduring power to provoke, to divide, and to dominate the conversation. The viral explosion marked a turning point in the story. The joke was no longer Stewart's. It belonged to the internet, to the culture at large. It had become bigger than the man who delivered it and bigger than the woman it targeted. It was a moment of raw humor that captured a cultural truth, and in doing so, it became unstoppable. By the end of the week, the Duchess of Dumbshit line wasn't just a trending phrase. It was a symbol. To some, it symbolized courage, the willingness to say what others were too afraid to. To others, it symbolized cruelty, the ugly side of comedy weaponized against a woman already battered by the media. But no matter how people felt about it, they couldn't ignore it. And in the world of virality, being inescapable is the ultimate measure of success. The internet thrives on speed, and within hours of Jon Stewart's joke going viral, the pushback had begun. Meghan Markle may be polarizing, but she is not without her defenders. Her network of allies, public supporters, and sympathetic commentators wasted no time in countering the tidal wave of laughter and ridicule that had swept across social media. For them, the Duchess of Dumbshit line wasn't just a punchline. It was a weapon that threatened to undo years of carefully crafted messaging around Meghan as a woman who had endured cruelty, racism, and rejection from one of the most powerful institutions in the world. The first signs of backlash emerged from celebrity circles. A handful of well-known figures who had previously stood by Meghan, actors, activists, and fellow public figures, posted statements online. They framed Stewart's words as an attack not just on Meghan, but on women who dare to challenge tradition. "We shouldn't be laughing at a woman who spoke out about racism and mental health," one actress wrote on Instagram. "This isn't comedy. This is cruelty." Another tweeted that Stewart had crossed the line, suggesting the joke was less satire and more harassment. These defenses didn't carry the same virality as the original joke, but they signaled a coordinated effort to reclaim the narrative. Meghan's PR machinery also began to move. Journalists sympathetic to her story quickly published op-eds criticizing Stewart. One column in a major outlet argued that mocking Meghan revealed society's deep discomfort with outspoken women, especially women of color, who disrupt established power structures. Another piece framed Stewart's joke as emblematic of a broader trend: powerful men using humor to silence women who tell their truth. These narratives sought to shift the conversation away from the joke itself and back onto Meghan's position as a survivor of unfair scrutiny. Even within activist circles, debates ignited. Some organizations, particularly those connected to Meghan's philanthropic projects, released statements condemning Stewart. They painted his joke as an attack on Meghan's advocacy work, suggesting that mocking her undermines serious issues like racial inequality, women's rights, and mental health awareness. In this framing, Stewart wasn't just mocking Meghan. He was mocking every cause she represented. For her allies, tying her identity to these larger issues was a strategic way of framing criticism of Meghan as criticism of justice itself. But the counteroffensive wasn't without its challenges. For every defense of Meghan, there were 10 responses repeating Stewart's line or mocking the attempt to control the narrative. Social media thrives on humor more than outrage, and the simplicity of Duchess of Dumbshit was impossible to counter with long essays or carefully worded defenses. The defenders often ended up amplifying the joke, inadvertently ensuring it spread. Screenshots of op-eds criticizing Stewart were shared with mocking captions, and each televised debate replayed the original punchline for context, keeping it alive. Still, the pushback mattered. It gave Meghan's supporters a rallying cry and reminded audiences that she wasn't universally despised. It also highlighted the cultural divide. To her allies, the reaction to Stewart's joke was proof of the unfair double standard Meghan faced compared to other royals. They pointed out that Kate Middleton had rarely been subjected to such blunt public mockery and suggested that the ridicule directed at Meghan carried undertones of prejudice. In their framing, Stewart hadn't just told a joke. He had exposed the biases of a society eager to tear down women who step outside the mold. Meanwhile, Meghan herself remained silent. Silence has always been her strategy in moments like this, letting allies speak on her behalf while she avoids feeding the fire. But silence also fuels speculation. Was she furious behind the scenes? Was she considering a public statement? Or was she biding her time, waiting for the controversy to fade as others fought the battle for her? That uncertainty added to the drama, as commentators on both sides speculated endlessly about how she was processing the humiliation. Harry's name began to surface in the debate as well. Some critics asked whether he would defend his wife publicly, while others mocked him for his silence. His absence from the conversation became its own story. Supporters framed it as dignified restraint, while detractors painted it as cowardice or evidence of marital strain. For Meghan's allies, this added complexity was unwelcome. They wanted to keep the focus on Stewart's supposed cruelty, but the silence from the Sussexes themselves made the defense feel less coordinated and more reactive. The backlash also highlighted the fragility of Meghan's public image. For years, she had worked to cast herself as someone wronged by powerful institutions. But Stewart was not a monarch, nor a tabloid. He was a comedian, someone audiences trusted to puncture pretension. Attacking him for cruelty didn't resonate the same way as attacking a hostile press. Instead, it risked making Meghan look thin-skinned, unable to withstand even the satire that public figures inevitably attract. Some commentators even suggested that if Meghan wanted to rebuild her reputation, she should laugh it off. But Meghan's allies weren't interested in laughter. They were interested in control. By the end of the first week after the special aired, the landscape was clear. Meghan's defenders had rallied, producing articles, statements, and social media campaigns to counter Stewart's joke. But the joke itself remained dominant. It was repeated, shared, and memed endlessly, drowning out most attempts to reframe the conversation. The allies had struck back, but their strikes seemed weak against the tidal wave of humor. What their efforts did accomplish, however, was to deepen the division. Supporters of Meghan became more entrenched, convinced Stewart's line revealed society's cruelty. Critics became louder, mocking the defenses as proof that Meghan and her allies couldn't take a joke. And in that divide, the story thrived. The more people argued about whether Stewart was right or wrong, the more attention the joke received. The defense had failed to kill it, but it had succeeded in keeping it alive. In the days following Jon Stewart's Netflix special, the cultural storm around his joke about Meghan Markle grew larger, louder, and more unavoidable. By this point, the phrase Duchess of Dumbshit was no longer just a throwaway line in a comedy set. It had become a cultural lightning rod. Social media churned with memes and debates. The press dissected it in endless cycles, and Meghan's allies scrambled to frame it as cruel rather than clever. But while her defenders pushed back, another camp stepped forward with a very different perspective: comedians. One by one, voices from the comedy world began weighing in. They weren't merely amused by Stewart's joke. They defended it as necessary, timely, and even courageous. To them, what Stewart had done wasn't just roast a controversial figure. He had struck a blow for comedy itself, for the right of comedians to hold up a mirror to culture without being muzzled by fear of outrage. The first wave of support came from comedians who had long admired Stewart's work. On podcasts, stand-up stages, and in interviews, they praised his timing, his delivery, and most importantly, his willingness to say what others were too afraid to. That's what comedy is supposed to do. One comedian said during a popular podcast episode, "You take the thing everyone's talking about, the elephant in the room, and you say it in the funniest, sharpest way possible." Stewart nailed it. Another joke that Stewart had done the Lord's work by condensing years of media drama into 3 unforgettable words. Comedy clubs across the country became echo chambers for the moment. Open mic performers and established headliners alike began referencing the Duchess of Dumbshit line in their own sets, sometimes quoting it directly, other times using it as a springboard to roast Meghan further. The audience reactions were consistent: uproarious laughter, applause, and cheers. For comedians, the line wasn't just funny, it was liberating. It reminded them that the art of comedy still had the power to dominate the conversation, to shake the culture, even in a time when many comedians felt under siege by cancel culture and hypersensitivity. Late-night hosts also joined in, some playfully ribbing Stewart, others openly siding with him. One monologue quipped, "You know you've made history when Meghan Markle's PR team is working overtime because Jon Stewart said 3 words." Another joked that Meghan should consider adding Duchess of Dumbshit to her list of titles, since it's the only one the public seems to believe. These weren't just jokes at Meghan's expense. They were acknowledgments of Stewart's dominance. His line had set the comedic agenda, and everyone else was following his lead. Behind the humor, though, there was something more serious at play. Comedians had been feeling the squeeze of cultural restrictions for years. Every time a joke sparked backlash, debates erupted about whether comedy had gone too far. Some comedians had lost gigs, shows, and opportunities over controversial material. The Stewart moment became a rallying point, a reminder that comedy could still hit hard and survive. Defending Stewart wasn't just about Meghan. It was about defending their own craft. This rallying effect also highlighted a divide between comedy and Meghan's defenders. While her allies framed the joke as cruelty, comedians framed it as truth. To them, Meghan was not a powerless victim. She was one of the most famous women in the world, living in mansions, signing multi-million-dollar deals, and commanding global attention. Mocking her wasn't bullying. It was punching up, targeting someone who had willingly stepped into the public arena and reaped the rewards of fame. Stewart's defenders argued that if someone as privileged as Meghan couldn't be joked about, then comedy itself would cease to exist. Some comedians even took the opportunity to expand on Stewart's critique. They pointed out the contradictions in Meghan's public persona, calling for privacy while launching a Netflix documentary, condemning the media while courting it, presenting herself as a victim while signing lucrative deals. To them, Stewart hadn't just told a joke, he had exposed hypocrisy. And in their world, Exposing hypocrisy is the highest calling of satire. Not everyone in comedy agreed, of course. A few voices warned that Stewart's joke might backfire, that comedians risked being seen as cruel if they piled on too hard. But those voices were drowned out by the overwhelming support. For every critic, there were dozens who doubled down, insisting that the line was not only fair but necessary. One stand-up veteran put it bluntly: "If Meghan Markle can't take a joke, she shouldn't be in the spotlight." That's the deal with fame. You want the cameras, you get the comedians too. As the days turned into weeks, Stewart himself remained relatively quiet. He didn't need to explain or defend his joke. The comedy world was doing it for him. His silence gave the impression of confidence, as if to say the work spoke for itself. And in many ways, it did. The line continued to circulate, supported not just by audiences but by Stewart's peers, whose validation gave it even more cultural weight. The rallying of comedians also created an unexpected effect. It reframed the narrative. Meghan's allies had tried to position Stewart as cruel, but the comedy community insisted he was courageous. That framing mattered, because comedy isn't judged only by the audience. It's judged by other comedians. And when Stewart's peers stood by him, it solidified the moment as legitimate satire rather than cheap ridicule. In the end, the comedian's support ensured that the Duchess of Dumbshit moment would not fade as a passing controversy. Instead, it became cemented as a cultural milestone, one of those rare comedic lines that leap off the stage and into the bloodstream of society. For Meghan, that meant the joke was inescapable. For Stewart, it meant he had once again reminded the world why his voice carried weight. And for comedians everywhere, it was a rallying cry, proof that comedy still mattered, still had teeth, and still had the power to shake the powerful.